Read the story of Jesus in the Gospels and look at the historical context in which Jesus finds himself and the people to whom he speaks. And one thing becomes really apparent, that the people to whom he spoke these words of life and hope from day to day were deeply in need of the life that his words represented. Why? Because they were religious doers hemmed in tightly by the daily pressure of religious doing. They knew from memory the rights and wrongs that religious people know, but they didn't really know what it meant to know God personally. They were religious doers. They did the law and they did the prophets. They could tell you the many and varied things they knew about the behavioral aspects of being religious people, but struggled to know the God they talked about. But that was until now. This young rabbi's God talk was altogether different from the God talk of anyone they had ever heard. For the first time since anyone could remember, God seemed accessible. He seemed knowable. Once again, he seemed believable. Jesus was taking God beyond their religious doing. He was taking it to being in God, and once again, being one with God. For the first time, people began to sense that a person could be right with God and live in hope without the stress of feeling like there was somehow a disappointment to God. The kingdom that this rabbi was presenting wasn't primarily about doing right. It was first and foremost about being in. Jesus had already told them at the beginning of his teachings on the Sermon on the Mount that in the context of doing, unless their righteousness, their doing, exceeded the output of the Pharisees, they were already locked out of the kingdom. It was a done deal for them. But he said that just to make the point that they were living in a kingdom of doers, but the kingdom of God was entirely different. His manifesto, his Sermon on the Mount, isn't an upgrade on perfection. It's a downgrade on misdirected and misinformed effort. The manifesto isn't a correction of how you now do it right. It's a description of what being in God and being born of the Spirit look like. The temple had become the place where they assembled only to just get it right. That was all. But the life of the Spirit, the internal deepening that the Spirit brings, had left the temple. It had left their worship, their religious meaning, and their sense of being connected to God. So they listened. And as Jesus speaks to the law and the prophets in Matthew 5, and they hear the intentions of the Spirit and the intention of the kingdom, they immediately know that they were truly hearing the law and the prophets for the first time. He somehow went past the violence that they did to the heart of the anger and rage that drove human behavior, and pointed out that that was the place, the primary ground zero place that God was dealing with them. He knew that the struggle wasn't in the extramarital affair they were trying to avoid. It was in the mind that secretly carried on the emotional and mental affair regardless. He went deeper than the legal right to divorce. He went to the heart of destructive emotional irresponsibility, the heart that devalues and casts aside the institution of marriage at a whim. It wasn't enough that we retaliate like for like. The kingdom was asking us to match like with love. And as they listen, they realize that their true struggle for the first time is being addressed. And what was that struggle? It was this: their religious doing wasn't doing anything about the things they were actually struggling with. They lived with the constant weight of somehow being a disappointment to a God they knew things about but didn't really know personally. The trappings said it was right, but their heart, their emptiness, and their deep need within their spirit knew that somehow it just wasn't enough. Oh, how times change while they remain the same, eh? Come on now. Is it only me? Or do you feel like what we've turned church into is just another space and just another way to get it right. Somewhere along the line, we lost the church experience of being in. And being in simply means living and thriving in assured relation to and relationship with God. It involves a patient and steady growing out of us, growing out of the me and growing into Him. It involves that transparency, that beautiful transparency that David wrote about in Psalms 139 when he said, "Search me, O God, know my heart. I give you permission, test me, know my thoughts. See where there is any wicked way in me and lead me in the way everlasting." This is what they are beginning to understand as they listen to that young rabbi sitting on that mountainside in Galilee. You know, sometimes the truth of God hits you like a last chance, and at other times it hits you like a first awakening. And if John the Baptist was a revival in Israel, then Jesus from Nazareth was the awakening that resulted. He was saying everything again. That's what he was doing. He was saying everything again. He was saying everything anew. He was saying everything right. What does love look like? It looks like this. God takes on human flesh, and God becomes a rabbi, and he is sitting on a mountainside in Galilee, speaking into the human experience and the human struggle, and the people are experiencing a first awakening. Today, in this universal pause we globally find ourselves in, just as yesterday on that mountainside, God isn't asking us to change our reality in order to come into His reality. Why? Because He is loving first. And when you love first, you move first. So He is stepping into our reality and asking us to allow ourselves to be drawn into Him and His reality and to His knowing. Because He knows that once we do, everything we find will change us. Am I saying that doing is irrelevant? Well, of course, I'm not saying doing is irrelevant. But doing is a reflection of a mindset and a heart that is established. I'm saying that when God deals with us, He's not starting from our doing, because He has already said, as a person thinks, so they are. So our ground zero is a new birth, a new heart. He said through Jeremiah 24 and verse 7, He said, "I will give you a heart to know me." He said through Paul in 2 Timothy 1:7 that God will not give us the spirit of fear, but He has given us a spirit of power and of love and a sound mind. Being in is about being in the settled reality of God, the settled reality of faith in Him, the settled reality of surrender. And surrender simply means that we stop fighting God where He's trying to grow us. The settled reality that we are accepted by God, and now that we are accepted by God, we will be transformed by God. And the subtle reality of divine human reconnection. We are connected back to the divine. When He came to His disciples, Jesus knew this. It's not year one, it's 3.5 years later. And they sit at the Passover table, unaware of where they find themselves, unaware of what is about to transpire, still the masters of doing, but not being in. The masters of doing, even though they have actually, literally been with God for 3.5 years. Watch them. They sit jostling for position and power. Lord, can I sit at your right hand? Lord, can I sit at your left hand? But they sit with denial and betrayal and fear in their heart. It's a sad picture that Jesus is asking us to look at, but He's saying, no, keep looking and look deeper. Because when you look deeper, you'll see the patience of a God who loves patiently. Death will bring life. Doing to impress will be replaced with surrendered being in. The question that God asks us in 2020 is, where do we choose to live in this new big thing that God is making possible? So here's the action point. I want you to write down what new big thing you want God to make possible in your life. What new big thing you want Him to do in your life. I want you to write down what being in with God looks like. I want you to write down what surrender looks like. And when I say surrender, I mean where you stop fighting God where He is trying to grow you. Write it down, pray it out, share it with a friend.